4 graves were found empty in southeastern Kansas on a bitter February morning in 1873. The freshly turned earth had been disturbed sometime during the night, and by dawn, the bodies that should have been resting there had simply vanished. Local authorities would later claim the graves had been robbed by medical students from a nearby college, but you need to understand something about Labette County in 1873. Medical students didn't travel 60 miles through hostile territory to steal corpses from a windswept prairie cemetery. And they certainly didn't leave behind the kind of evidence that was discovered 3 days later. What happened to those 4 bodies would remain officially unexplained for over a century. But the truth is far more disturbing than grave robbery, and it connects to a family that terrorized the Kansas frontier for nearly 3 years before disappearing into the American wilderness like smoke. The Bender family didn't just kill their victims, they perfected a method of murder so efficient, so coldly calculated, that it would influence criminal enterprises across the expanding frontier for decades to come. You're about to learn why the Bender name was spoken in whispers from Dodge City to Independence, and why certain government officials worked very hard to ensure that their complete story never saw the light of day. Because the Benders weren't just serial killers. They were something far more dangerous. They were innovators. The first documented mention of the Bender family appears in a Labette County Land Office record dated March 15, 1871. John Bender Sr., described as a German immigrant of approximately 50 years, filed a claim for 160 acres of prairie land under the Homestead Act. The property sat along the Osage Trail, a heavily traveled route connecting Independence, Missouri to various settlements in southern Kansas. What makes this land filing unusual isn't its location. Many settlers chose spots near established trails for the obvious commercial advantages. What's unusual is the speed with which the Benders constructed their operations. Most homesteaders spent their first year building a basic shelter and breaking ground for crops. The Benders had a fully operational inn and general store within 6 months of filing their claim. They also had something else, a reputation for being able to provide travelers with services that couldn't be found anywhere else along that particular stretch of the Osage Trail. Services that weren't advertised in any newspaper or mentioned in any official capacity, but which drew a very specific type of clientele to their establishment. John Bender Sr. spoke broken English with a heavy German accent, and neighbors described him as a man of few words who kept to himself. His wife Elvira was reportedly in her 40s, though official records of her age don't exist. She claimed to be a spiritualist and advertised her services as a healer and medium. Their son, John Jr., was in his 20s and helped run the inn, but it was their daughter, Kate, who became the face of the family business. Kate Bender was described by contemporary accounts as uncommonly beautiful, with dark hair and striking eyes. She spoke perfect English, unlike her parents, and had received what appeared to be a formal education. She could read and write fluently, understand basic accounting, and possessed a knowledge of human anatomy that was, according to local Dr. Theodore York, remarkably sophisticated for a frontier woman. Kate advertised herself as a professor of the supernatural, claiming she could heal the sick and communicate with the dead. More importantly, she served as the family's liaison with their customers. The Bender Inn consisted of a single large room divided by a canvas curtain. The front half served as a general store and dining area. The back half was the family's living quarters. Travelers could purchase supplies, eat a meal, and rent space on the floor for the night. The arrangement was typical for frontier establishments, but the Benders had made one modification that would prove crucial to their operations. Behind the canvas curtain that separated the public area from the family quarters, they had dug a cellar. This wasn't unusual. Many frontier families maintained root cellars for food storage, but the Bender cellar had been excavated to unusual specifications. It was deeper than necessary for storing vegetables, and it had been lined with stones that had been carefully selected and fitted to create a completely watertight seal. The cellar also had an unusual drainage system that channeled any liquids away from the inn and toward a natural depression about 200 yards behind the property. Dr. Theodore York, who would later examine the cellar, noted that its construction demonstrated a level of engineering sophistication that exceeded the apparent capabilities of the family. Someone had possessed considerable knowledge of excavation, drainage, and stone masonry. Someone had planned this construction very carefully. The Benders' first documented customer was a cattle buyer named William Johnson, who stopped at the inn on September 3, 1871. Johnson was traveling alone, carrying approximately $300 in cash, and planning to continue south toward Texas the following morning. He shared dinner with the family and rented sleeping space for the night. According to Kate Bender's later testimony to local authorities, Johnson left early the following morning and continued south along the trail. But Johnson never arrived at his destination in Texas. His business partners in Dodge City became concerned when he failed to appear for a scheduled cattle purchase, and they sent inquiries back along his planned route. The Benders were questioned about Johnson's visit, and they provided consistent, detailed accounts of his stay. He had seemed pleased with their service, had paid his bill promptly, and had departed in good spirits. They had no knowledge of what might have happened to him after he left their property. The investigation into Johnson's disappearance was cursory. Men vanished on the frontier for dozens of reasons: Indian raids, bandits, accidents, wild animals, weather. The fact that Johnson was carrying cash made robbery the most likely explanation. Local Sheriff Thomas McClure noted that Johnson could have been killed anywhere along the 200-mile stretch between the Bender Inn and Dodge City. The case was classified as an unsolved disappearance, and the matter was dropped. 3 weeks later, a German immigrant named Heinrich Kellerman stopped at the Bender Inn. Kellerman was traveling with his 2 teenage sons, heading west to establish a farm in Colorado Territory. Like Johnson, they shared dinner with the family and spent the night. Unlike Johnson, they left behind evidence of their stay. A neighboring homesteader named Samuel Rogers discovered Kellerman's wagon abandoned approximately 5 miles west of the Bender property. The wagon still contained most of the family's possessions, including farming tools, seed grain, and personal belongings. The horses were gone, as were Kellerman and his sons. Rogers reported the discovery to Sheriff McClure, who organized a search of the surrounding area. The search turned up no trace of the missing family, but it did reveal something interesting about the abandoned wagon. The wooden floor showed stains that Dr. York, who accompanied the search party, identified as blood. The staining pattern suggested that something had bled extensively while lying in the wagon bed. The blood had soaked through the wood and dried in a way that indicated it had been there for several days. Sheriff McClure questioned the Benders about the Kellerman family and once again received consistent, detailed accounts. Heinrich Kellerman had seemed nervous about traveling with such a large amount of supplies, worried about bandits or Indian raids. The family had discussed taking a more northern route to avoid potential trouble. Kate Bender specifically remembered Kellerman mentioning his concern about being followed, and suggesting that he might change his route after leaving their inn. The discovery of the abandoned wagon did prompt a more thorough investigation, but it yielded no additional evidence. The blood in the wagon could have come from dozens of sources. The missing horses suggested robbery, which was unfortunately common along frontier trails. The absence of bodies could be explained by wild animals or by killers who wanted to prevent identification of their victims. Sheriff McClure concluded that the Kellerman family had most likely been killed by bandits somewhere between the Bender Inn and their discovery point of the abandoned wagon. But Dr. Theodore York had begun to notice something that troubled him deeply. He had examined the bloodstains in the Kellerman wagon, and the pattern was wrong. The blood hadn't come from people who had been attacked and killed in the wagon. It had come from bodies that had been placed in the wagon after death and had lain there for a considerable period of time. The staining pattern indicated that the bodies had been positioned carefully, not thrown in during a violent struggle. Dr. York shared his observations with Sheriff McClure, who dismissed them as speculation. Without bodies, there was no way to determine exactly what had happened to the Kellerman family. The case remained open but inactive, filed alongside dozens of other unsolved disappearances that plagued the Kansas frontier. The Benders continued operating their inn through the winter of 1871, and into the spring of 1872. They served travelers, sold supplies, and Kate continued to advertise her services as a spiritualist and healer. Local residents described them as quiet but friendly neighbors who kept to themselves and caused no trouble. Kate occasionally attended social gatherings in nearby Independence, where she was well regarded for her education and refinement. The family attended church services sporadically, and John Sr. sometimes helped neighboring homesteaders with heavy labor. But travelers continued to disappear. Between October 1871 and March 1872, at least 6 more individuals went missing along the stretch of the Osage Trail that passed the Bender property. The disappearances followed a consistent pattern. Solitary travelers, usually men, typically carrying cash or valuable supplies, last seen in the vicinity of the Bender Inn. In each case, the travelers had told someone their intended destination and approximate travel schedule. In each case, they simply vanished without reaching that destination. Local authorities began to take notice, but they were facing a practical problem that plagued law enforcement across the frontier. Jurisdiction was unclear, evidence was scarce, and communication between different counties and territories was sporadic at best. A man could disappear in Labette County and not be reported missing until his family in Missouri or Texas began asking questions weeks later. By then, any evidence of what had happened to him would likely be gone. More importantly, the disappearances weren't confined to a single location. Men were vanishing all along the Osage Trail, from Independence to the Oklahoma border. The Bender Inn was just one of dozens of establishments that catered to travelers along that route. Without concrete evidence linking the disappearances to a specific location or individual, there was little that law enforcement could do beyond encouraging travelers to move in groups and stay alert for potential threats. Dr. Theodore York, however, had begun conducting his own investigation. As the only medical professional in the immediate area, he was often called upon to examine evidence related to unexplained deaths or disappearances. He had started keeping detailed records of every case that came to his attention, and he was beginning to see patterns that disturbed him greatly. The missing travelers shared certain characteristics beyond their tendency to travel alone. They were typically men between the ages of 25 and 50. They were usually carrying significant amounts of cash, enough to make robbery worthwhile, but not so much as to attract excessive attention. They were generally traveling to locations that were several days' journey from the point where they were last seen, which meant that their disappearances wouldn't be noticed immediately. Most importantly, they were all people who wouldn't be missed right away. Immigrants with no local connections, businessmen traveling between distant cities, settlers heading to new territories where no one was expecting them. Dr. York's record showed that the disappearances weren't random. Someone was selecting victims based on very specific criteria. Someone who understood how frontier communication worked, who knew how long it would take for a missing person to be reported, and who had detailed knowledge of travel patterns along the Osage Trail. Someone who was in a perfect position to observe potential victims, assess their vulnerabilities, and act on that information. The breakthrough in what would become known as the Bender case came in March 1873, when a man named William York failed to arrive at his destination in Fort Scott. William was Dr. Theodore York's brother, a successful businessman who had been traveling from Independence to Fort Scott on a routine business trip. He had last been seen on March 9, 1873, and was expected to arrive in Fort Scott no later than March 12th. When he failed to appear, his business associates contacted Dr. York, who immediately organized a search party. Unlike the previous disappearances, Dr. York had specific information about his brother's travel plans. William had told several people that he intended to stop at the Bender Inn for supplies and possibly to spend the night. He had also mentioned his intention to travel directly from the inn to Fort Scott along the most direct route. Dr. York knew exactly where to focus his search. The search party arrived at the Bender Inn on March 15, 1873. Dr. York questioned the family about his brother's visit and received the same type of consistent, detailed account that the Benders had provided in previous cases. William York had stopped at the inn, purchased supplies, and shared dinner with the family. He had seemed to be in good spirits and had mentioned his business in Fort Scott. He had left early the following morning, traveling south toward his destination. But this time, Dr. York wasn't satisfied with the Benders' explanation. He knew his brother well, and some of the details in their account didn't match William's normal behavior patterns. More importantly, Dr. York had been studying the previous disappearances for over a year, and he had begun to suspect that the Bender Inn was more than just an unfortunate coincidence. Dr. York requested permission to search the inn and the surrounding property. The Benders agreed readily, expressing concern for William's safety and eagerness to help with the investigation. They guided the search party through their establishment, pointing out where William had sat for dinner, where he had slept, and the direction he had taken when he departed the following morning. The search of the public areas revealed nothing suspicious. The inn was clean, well organized, and showed no signs of violence or struggle. The family's living quarters behind the canvas curtain were similarly unremarkable. But when Dr. York asked to examine the cellar, Kate Bender's demeanor changed noticeably. She explained that the cellar was used for food storage and contained nothing that would be relevant to the investigation. She seemed reluctant to allow the search party access, claiming that the space was cramped and poorly lit. When Dr. York insisted, she agreed, but warned that the cellar was in poor condition and might be dangerous. The cellar, when finally examined, was anything but poorly maintained. The stone construction was solid and well crafted. The space was larger than expected, and it had been divided into distinct areas for different purposes. Most of the cellar appeared to be used for legitimate food storage, but one section had been excavated to unusual depth and showed signs of recent activity. The floor of this deeper section was covered with loose dirt that appeared to have been disturbed recently. Dr. York noted that the soil was darker than the surrounding earth, and it had an unusual odor that he recognized from his medical practice. The smell of decomposition. When Dr. York pointed out these observations to Sheriff McClure, Kate Bender quickly provided an explanation. They had recently slaughtered a pig in the cellar during cold weather and had buried the waste products in that section of the floor. The dark soil and unusual odor were the result of that activity. She seemed eager to help the search party understand what they were observing, and her explanations were detailed and plausible. But York had examined enough crime scenes to recognize the difference between animal waste and human decomposition. The odor coming from the disturbed soil was definitely human in origin. More importantly, the pattern of soil disturbance suggested that something large had been buried and then recently removed. Dr. York convinced Sheriff McClure to excavate the suspicious section of the cellar floor. The Benders watched nervously as the search party began digging, and Kate continued to provide explanations for anything unusual they might discover. She seemed particularly concerned that they not damage her family's food storage areas during their excavation. The digging revealed something that changed everything. About 3 feet below the surface, the search party uncovered fragments of human bone and tissue. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, but Dr. York was able to identify them as human rather than animal. More significantly, the bones showed evidence of severe trauma that was consistent with violent death. The discovery of human remains in the Bender cellar prompted an immediate expansion of the investigation. Sheriff McClure sent word to authorities in adjacent counties, requesting assistance with what was clearly a major criminal case. He also posted guards around the Bender property to prevent the family from leaving while the investigation continued. But when the expanded search party arrived the following morning, the Bender family was gone. Sometime during the night of March 15, 1873, all 4 members of the Bender family had disappeared. They had taken their horses, some personal belongings, and whatever cash they had on hand. They had left behind their inn, their homestead claim, and most of their possessions. They had also left behind evidence that would reveal the true scope of their activities. The expanded excavation of the Bender cellar uncovered the remains of 11 different individuals. The bodies had been buried in carefully arranged layers, with the most recent victims near the surface and the oldest at the bottom. Dr. York's examination of the remains revealed that all of the victims had died from severe head trauma, typically from blunt force applied to the back of the skull. The injuries were consistent with a single, powerful blow delivered while the victim was seated or lying down. The arrangement of the bodies in the cellar showed a level of organization that disturbed the investigators deeply. The victims had been stripped of clothing and valuables before burial. They had been positioned carefully to maximize the use of available space. Most significantly, The condition of the remains suggested that the bodies had been systematically processed to accelerate decomposition and minimize odor. Dr. York's analysis indicated that the Benders had been killing travelers for nearly 2 years. The victims ranged in age from the early 20s to late 50s, and all appeared to be men who had been traveling alone. Based on personal effects found in the cellar, the victims had carried substantial amounts of cash and had been traveling to distant destinations where their disappearances wouldn't be noticed immediately. The method of killing was as efficient as it was brutal. Dr. York's examination of the cellar revealed that the Benders had modified their inn specifically to facilitate murder. The dining table was positioned directly over a trapdoor that led to the cellar. When a victim sat with his back to the canvas curtain that divided the room, his head would be positioned directly beneath a specific point on the ceiling. The Benders had installed a heavy wooden beam above this position, and the beam showed clear evidence of repeated impact. Dr. York concluded that the family had used a sledgehammer or similar tool to deliver fatal blows through the canvas curtain. The victim would be seated at the table, unaware of the danger, when one of the family members would strike from behind the curtain. The blow would be delivered with enough force to cause immediate death, and the victim would fall forward onto the table or floor. The trapdoor beneath the dining table allowed the family to dispose of bodies quickly and efficiently. They could move the victim from the dining area to the cellar without carrying the body outside, where it might be observed by other travelers or neighbors. Once in the cellar, they could strip the body of valuables and clothing, then bury it in the specially prepared section of the floor. The system was coldly efficient, and it explained how the Benders had been able to kill so many people without arousing suspicion. Victims simply disappeared between one location and another, leaving no evidence of violence at the inn itself. Any blood would be cleaned up immediately, and the bodies would be hidden in the cellar until they could be permanently disposed of. But the discovery of 11 bodies in the cellar raised an important question. How many other victims were there? Dr. York's records showed that far more than 11 travelers had disappeared along that section of the Osage Trail during the Benders' operation. The cellar might represent only a fraction of their total victim count. The search of the property expanded to include the areas surrounding the inn. Using Dr. York's knowledge of the cellar's drainage system, the investigators began examining the natural depression behind the property where liquids from the cellar were channeled. They also searched areas where the family might have disposed of bodies that couldn't be accommodated in the increasingly crowded cellar. The expanded search revealed evidence of additional victims. The investigators found scattered human bones, fragments of clothing, and personal effects buried in various locations around the property. They also discovered what appeared to be a secondary burial site about half a mile from the inn, where several more bodies had been disposed of in a hastily excavated mass grave. Dr. York's final count identified evidence of at least 21 different victims, though he suspected the actual number might be higher. Some of the remains were too fragmentary or decomposed to allow for accurate identification, and it was possible that some victims had been disposed of in locations that the search parties never discovered. The scope of the Bender killings was unprecedented in Kansas territory. No other criminal case had involved so many victims or such a sophisticated method of operation. The family had essentially operated a murder business, systematically killing travelers for nearly 2 years while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate frontier enterprise. The investigation also revealed the source of the Benders' apparent wealth. Among the family's possessions, investigators found approximately $2,000 in cash, along with jewelry, watches, and other valuables that had clearly belonged to their victims. They also discovered detailed records that Kate Bender had maintained, documenting the family's transactions with various travelers. Kate's records showed that the family had been remarkably systematic in their selection of victims. They had maintained information about potential targets, including details about their travel plans, the amount of cash they were carrying, and their likelihood of being missed quickly if they disappeared. The records also revealed that the family had occasionally allowed certain travelers to leave unharmed, apparently when they determined that the risk of killing them outweighed the potential profit. The records indicated that the Benders had been in contact with other individuals who may have assisted their operations or shared information about potential victims. Several entries mentioned names and locations that suggested the family was part of a larger network of criminals operating along frontier travel routes. But before investigators could follow up on these connections, they faced a more immediate problem: finding the Bender family. The manhunt for the Benders became one of the largest law enforcement efforts in Kansas Territory history. Sheriff McClure coordinated with authorities in Missouri, Oklahoma, and Colorado, sharing descriptions of the family and details about their crimes. Reward notices were posted throughout the region, offering substantial payments for information leading to the capture of any family member. The search focused initially on the assumption that the family had fled west, toward the less settled territories where they might be able to disappear more easily. Posses searched along known travel routes and questioned residents of towns and settlements throughout Kansas and the surrounding territories. Several reported sightings led to extended pursuits, but none resulted in actual captures. As weeks passed without success, investigators began to suspect that the Benders had planned their escape well in advance. The family had clearly been prepared to abandon their operation quickly if necessary, and they had likely established escape routes and safe havens long before their crimes were discovered. Dr. York's analysis of the evidence suggested that the Benders had possessed knowledge and resources that exceeded what would be expected from simple frontier criminals. Their method of operation showed sophistication and planning that indicated possible connections to organized criminal enterprises. The detailed records they had maintained suggested experience with similar operations, possibly in other locations. Most significantly, the timing of their escape suggested that they had been warned about the investigation. The family had disappeared on the same night that human remains were discovered in their cellar, before the full scope of their crimes had been revealed. Someone had apparently informed them that they were in immediate danger of arrest. The investigation into the Benders' possible accomplices revealed disturbing information about corruption within local law enforcement. Several officials had received payments from unknown sources during the period when the Benders were operating therein. At least 2 deputies had been seen meeting with Kate Bender on multiple occasions, purportedly to discuss her spiritual services, but possibly for other reasons. Sheriff McClure himself came under scrutiny when investigators discovered that he had been unusually reluctant to pursue the early disappearance cases aggressively. His explanations for the cursory investigations into the Johnson and Kellerman disappearances were called into question, particularly given Dr. York's repeated attempts to bring evidence to his attention. The corruption investigation revealed that the Benders had likely been protected by individuals within the local law enforcement and political establishment. This protection would have allowed them to operate for an extended period without serious interference, and it would have provided them with advance warning when their situation became untenable. But even with official protection, the Benders had ultimately been forced to flee. The discovery of William York's disappearance, combined with Dr. York's persistent investigation, had created too much attention for their protectors to deflect. The family had been forced to abandon their profitable operation and disappear into the American frontier. The manhunt continued for more than a year, but the Benders were never officially captured. Several reported sightings placed various family members in locations ranging from Texas to California, but none of these reports could be confirmed. The family had apparently separated after their escape, making tracking more difficult and reducing their chances of being recognized as a group. In late 1874, a woman matching Kate Bender's description was arrested in Oklahoma Territory on charges unrelated to the Kansas murders. Local authorities contacted Kansas officials, who sent Dr. York to examine the prisoner and determine if she was indeed Kate Bender. Dr. York spent several days interviewing the woman and concluded that while she resembled Kate Bender superficially, she was not the same person. Similar false identifications occurred regularly over the following years, as law enforcement officials and bounty hunters pursued anyone who might be connected to the case. The substantial rewards offered for the Benders' capture ensured that the search would continue long after the trail had gone cold. But by 1876, most officials had concluded that the Bender family had either died during their escape or had successfully established new identities in locations far from Kansas. The active manhunt was suspended, though the case remained officially open, and rewards continued to be offered for information leading to arrests. The Bender case had far-reaching implications beyond the immediate crimes. The revelation that a family had operated a systematic murder business on the Kansas frontier prompted significant changes in how law enforcement approached similar cases. The detailed methods that the Benders had developed were studied and shared among officials throughout the region, leading to improved investigative techniques and better coordination between different jurisdictions. The case also revealed the vulnerability of frontier travelers and the need for better communication systems to track missing persons across territorial boundaries. The Benders had exploited the isolation and poor communication that characterized frontier life, and their success highlighted the need for systematic reforms. More disturbing was the evidence of official corruption that had allowed the Benders to operate for so long. The investigation revealed that frontier law enforcement was susceptible to influence by organized criminal enterprises, and that the isolation of frontier communities made it difficult to detect and prevent such corruption. The Bender case became a cautionary tale that was shared throughout the expanding American frontier. Travelers were warned to avoid isolated establishments when possible, to travel in groups whenever feasible, and to maintain contact with people who could report their disappearances quickly if necessary. But for the people who had been directly affected by the Bender crimes, these systemic improvements provided little comfort. 21 families had lost loved ones to the Benders, systematic murder business, and justice had been denied by the family's successful escape. Dr. Theodore York continued his investigation into the case for the rest of his life, maintaining detailed files and pursuing any leads that might provide information about the family's fate. He corresponded with law enforcement officials throughout the country, sharing information and coordinating efforts to track down the fugitives. In his later writings, Dr. York expressed his belief that the Bender family had been part of a larger criminal organization that operated throughout the frontier regions. He cited the sophisticated nature of their operation, their apparent knowledge of law enforcement procedures, and the evidence of official corruption as indicators that they had not been acting independently. Dr. York also noted that similar murder businesses had been discovered in other frontier locations during the same time period, suggesting that the Benders' methods had been shared with or copied by other criminal groups. He documented at least 3 other cases in different territories, where travelers had been systematically murdered, using methods similar to those employed by the Benders. But despite Dr. York's continued efforts, the ultimate fate of the Bender family remained unknown. They had vanished into the vastness of the American frontier as completely as if they had never existed. The only traces of their presence were the graves of their victims and the persistent questions about how they had been able to operate for so long without detection. The questions about official corruption were never fully answered. Several law enforcement officials were quietly removed from their positions following the investigation, but no criminal charges were ever filed. The evidence of corruption was largely circumstantial, and the officials involved claimed that any payments they had received were for legitimate services unrelated to the Bender case. The broader implications of the case continued to resonate throughout the frontier regions for decades. The Bender name became synonymous with the dangers that travelers faced in isolated areas, and their story was repeated as a warning to anyone who might become too trusting of strangers in remote locations. But there was another aspect of the Bender case that troubled investigators and historians for years afterward. The family's successful escape suggested that they had possessed resources and connections that extended far beyond what was visible in their simple frontier inn. Someone had helped them plan their operation, and someone had helped them disappear when their crimes were discovered. The network that had supported the Benders was never identified or dismantled. The corruption that had protected them was never fully exposed or eliminated, and the methods they had developed for selecting and killing their victims were apparently shared with other criminal enterprises that continued operating long after the Benders themselves had vanished. In 1889, 16 years after the discovery of the Bender crimes, a series of similar murders was uncovered in Colorado Territory. The victims were travelers who had disappeared along established routes, and their bodies were found buried in carefully organized arrangements that matched the patterns discovered at the Bender property. The Colorado investigation revealed that the perpetrators had used methods nearly identical to those employed by the Benders, including the modified building design that allowed victims to be killed while seated at a dining table. The similarities were too extensive to be coincidental, suggesting that the Benders' techniques had been passed on to other criminal groups. Dr. York, now in his 70s, traveled to Colorado to examine the evidence personally. His analysis confirmed that the methods used in the Colorado murders were virtually identical to those he had documented in the Bender case. More significantly, he discovered evidence that some of the Colorado victims had been carrying items that appeared to have originated from the Bender property in Kansas. The connection between the Kansas and Colorado cases suggested that the Bender family, or individuals associated with them, might still be active nearly 2 decades after their original crimes were discovered. Dr. York shared his findings with Colorado authorities, but the investigation failed to identify the perpetrators of the more recent murders. Similar patterns of disappearances and murders continued to be reported throughout the frontier regions well into the 1890s. In each case, the methods showed similarities to the Bender techniques, and investigators found evidence of the same systematic approach to victim selection and disposal. The persistence of these crimes suggested that the Benders had been part of something larger than a single-family operation. They had apparently been connected to a criminal network that had survived their disappearance and continued to use their methods in other locations. But the full extent of this network was never determined. The investigation into the Bender case had revealed only a small portion of what appeared to be a much larger criminal enterprise. The family's escape had prevented authorities from learning about their connections and the scope of their activities. You need to understand what this means for anyone traveling through isolated areas even today. The Bender family represented something more dangerous than simple criminal opportunism. They had developed a systematic approach to murder that was efficient, profitable, and difficult to detect. More importantly, they had demonstrated that such operations could be protected by official corruption and supported by criminal networks that extended across territorial boundaries. The techniques they pioneered didn't disappear with their escape. They were adopted and adapted by other criminal enterprises throughout the expanding frontier. The Bender case wasn't just about one family of killers. It was about the creation of a blueprint for systematic murder that influenced criminal operations for generations. The 4 empty graves discovered in Labette County in February 1873 were never properly explained. The official story about medical students stealing corpses satisfied local authorities, but it didn't account for the evidence that was discovered afterward. Those graves had contained the bodies of Bender victims who had been temporarily buried in the local cemetery, while investigators determined their identities. Someone had removed those bodies during the night, and someone had done so with enough knowledge and planning to avoid detection. The theft of the corpses suggested that the Bender network was still active and still capable of protecting its interests even after the family's escape. Dr. York spent the final years of his life documenting what he had learned about the case and warning others about the continuing dangers. His writings described the Bender family as pioneers of a new type of criminal enterprise, one that combined systematic murder with sophisticated organizational structures and official protection. But Dr. York's warnings were largely ignored by officials who preferred to treat the Bender case as an isolated incident rather than acknowledging its broader implications. The idea that organized criminal networks could operate across territorial boundaries and corrupt local law enforcement was too disturbing for many people to accept. The truth about the Bender family and their connections died with Dr. York in 1901. His files and correspondence were sealed by his estate and have never been made fully public. The official records of the case were transferred to state archives, where they remain largely inaccessible to researchers and historians. What happened to the Bender family after their escape remains unknown. Whether they continued their criminal activities in other locations, whether they were killed by rivals or law enforcement in other territories, or whether they successfully established new identities and lived out their lives in obscurity, these questions have never been answered. But their legacy persists in ways that most people don't recognize. The methods they developed for systematic murder, the organizational structures they created for criminal enterprises, and the corruption networks they established to protect their operations. These innovations influenced criminal activities throughout the American frontier and beyond. You're now part of this story, whether you want to be or not. You know about the empty graves, about the network that was never dismantled, about the techniques that were never forgotten. You understand that the Bender family wasn't just an isolated group of frontier killers, but rather the visible tip of something much larger and more dangerous. And if you're traveling through isolated areas, if you're stopping at establishments run by friendly families who seem eager to help, if you're trusting strangers because they appear harmless and welcoming, you need to remember what happened to those 21 travelers who made the same assumptions along the Osage Trail in Kansas. The Benders are gone, but what they created lives on. And it's still out there, waiting for the next trusting traveler who believes that evil announces itself clearly and can be easily recognized and avoided. It doesn't. It usually looks exactly like a helpful family running a frontier inn, eager to provide you with exactly the services you need.